We're going to look at right angled trigonometry. The first thing you're going to need to do is learn these three equations. Sine theta equals O over H, cos theta equals A over H, and tan theta equals O over A. Unfortunately, no shortcuts, and when you're tackling any question, before I even begin to read the question, I'd write these three equations out ready. And what goes hand in hand with this is this little sort of saying, Sohcahtoa. This may in itself help you remember the pattern with these equations, and in particular we'll be using this to choose which of these equations that we're going to use with a particular problem. So just to reiterate, whenever I attempt a question with right angled trigonometry, I would just write these three equations out. I would also write this out, and you're setting yourself up to get the question right. I'm given a triangle here. It's a right angled triangle, so I know that this is going to work. You can only use this with right angled triangles. So the first thing I'm going to do is label the triangle. Now the first thing I'll label is the hypotenuse. This is the side that's opposite the right angle. That's its definition, and it will in truth always be the longest side, but that might be difficult to be able to ascertain if it's not a particularly good drawing. So it's opposite the right angle. The next side that I'll label is opposite. Now you choose the angle that's you're going to work with, and you may very well decide, well, I'm going to work with this angle 30 degrees. Consequently, this will be the opposite. Of course, you may realise that this, because some of the angles in a triangle is 180, you could have chosen this. There's nothing to stop you deciding, actually, I want to use this. And if you did choose this angle instead, which would be, of course, 60 degrees, then this would become the opposite. But no, I've chosen this angle. Consequently, this is the opposite side, and finally, I label the remaining side the adjacent. So that's step one, to label the triangle. Now I've got to select the appropriate equation. Now this is where this Sohcahtoa comes in. Which sides are important to me? Well, certainly the opposite is, because that contains information that I'm trying to find. So I can note that this is important to me. But H is the next most useful, because it gives me some information. And so on that basis I select my equation. Well, I can see here with the so I've got two of the three letters annotated, so that's the one I'm going to pick. If I was to choose this, I've only got the hypotenuse, and if I was to choose this, I've only got the opposite side. So it's certainly this is the one that I'm interested in, and consequently this is the equation that I'm going to use. So I write the equation out, but every time I come across an unknown that I know the value of, I'll substitute that value in. So I go to write out theta, the size of the angle, but actually I do know this. So instead of writing theta, I'll put in my 30 degrees equals O. I can't substitute a value in there because I don't know, and I go to write down H, but I do know that H is 20. And it's as simple as that. I've now written down my trigonometric equation that I need to solve. Now I cover in more detail in another video associated with this how to solve this trigonometric equation in the way that I would solve any equation. So do look at that, but just briefly, I've got I want to get O on its own, but at the moment it's being divided by 20, so I'm going to times both sides by 20 to undo this divide by 20. And then I can see that this simplifies to leave me with O equals 20 times sine 30, which of course you can put into your calculator and it will return the answer 10. So the answer is, remembering the units, 10 centimeters. Do look on my other video for how to solve these simple trigonometric equations, because it's this last step that usually causes the problems. We'll look at another example quite similar to the last, but again it's going to be a right angled trigonometry question because we've got this right angle here. So set yourself up to answer this question correctly. I'd always write down these three equations at the start of the question, and also this phrase, Sohcahtoa. So I've set myself up to get this right. Step 2, I'm going to label this triangle, and it's asking me to find this unknown angle. So this is what I'll start with is the side opposite the right angle. That will always be the hypotenuse. And then the angle that I'm interested in, it's this one, theta. So consequently it's this side that's going to be opposite, and I'm left with the adjacent. I then have got to choose which of these three equations I'm going to use, and that's where I use this phrase Sohcahtoa. So I can see here that certainly the two sides that it's obvious that I'm going to use are O and H. And again, if I just mark these off, it's obvious that actually it's this sine equation that's the one that's going to be useful to me. So as before, the steps are always the same. I'm going to write this equation out, but every time I come across an unknown that I know the value of, I can substitute it in. Well, in this time I don't know what the value of the angle is, but I go to write out O, but actually I do know that it's 14, and H, and again I do know that it's 20. And that's it. We've written out the simple trigonometric equation that we now need to solve. Again, this is described in more detail in the accompanying video, and many of you will simply know that in order to find an angle you use the shift button. So do have a look at my other video, but I'm going to jump a step here and just write it out as you would put it into your calculator. This is what you'd put into your calculator. And what you'll find is you'll get to the nearest whole number of degrees, 35 degrees. This is the last example I'll be looking at, and I've left the one that people have most difficulty with until the end, but hopefully this will explain it a little bit more. The first step, write down your trig equations and also your little phrase Sohcahtoa to set yourself up to get this question right. The second step is then to label the triangle. I'll label hypotenuse first, that's opposite the right angle, and then the angle that I'm interested in is 45 degrees. Consequently, this side opposite this angle that I'm interested in will label O for opposite, and I'm left with adjacent for the last side. I then decide which of the sides are of most interest to me. Well, certainly H, because this is what I'm trying to find, so certainly H. And then the next side that's going to be useful is A, because it gives me some information. O, for instance, I neither want to find the value of it, nor does it give me any information, so that's no use at all. So now I can clearly see from my phrase that it's this that I'm interested in, and therefore it's this trig equation that I'm going to use. And then, just as before, it's always the same steps except for the very last step. I'm going to write out this equation, and where I do know the value of an unknown, I'll substitute it in. So cos, and I go to write out theta, but actually I do know the value of the angle, so I can write in 45 degrees. I go to write out A for adjacent, but again I do know the value of A, it's 14. And finally with H, oops, I don't know the value of it, so I've got no choice, I've got to write out H there. So this is the penultimate step, the last step but one, and we need to solve this trigonometric equation. Now this is the one that people always find difficult because we've got a H, an unknown, on the bottom. Now in my other video I explain more carefully what we do, but basically we are going to take the reciprocal of the right hand side of the equation, in other words flip this, and because it's an equation we've got to do the same on the left, so we're going to flip the left as well. And what we're going to be left with, if I flip the left, is 1 over cos 45 degrees, and I flip the right, H over 14. So we're nearly there. Now I've got H on top, which is what I wanted, but it's being divided by 14, so I need to undo that. So I'm going to do the opposite of divide by 14 to undo that, which is times 14. And again, because I've done it on the right, I've got to do it on the left. This is just basic algebra. And I can see that's had the desired effect. If I simplify on the right, I see that if I times something by 14 only to divide it, or divide it by 14 only to times it, these will cancel out. So I'm left with H equals 14 times 1 over cos 45. And this is something that you can put into your calculator. Now if you do have any difficulty at all with this, it's going to be this last step. So it's algebra really that you'll need to look at, and my calculator gives me to 1 decimal place 19.8 centimeters. This seems right because, as we know, the hypotenuse is always the longest side. It is longer than 14 centimeters, so that's at least a good sort of check.